In the small, quiet town of Abbeville, Alabama, the legend of Huggin loomed like a dark cloud over the community. Whispers of a towering woman in black who roamed the streets at night to ensnare the unsuspecting in a suffocating embrace had been passed down for generations. Some dismissed it as a harmless tale, but curiosity had a way of taking hold, especially on still, moonlit nights. On one such evening, two teenagers ventured to the edge of town, drawn by a mix of boredom and the desire to prove the legend wrong. The air was cool, the silence broken only by the crunch of their footsteps on gravel. As they walked down a narrow road flanked by tall, shadowy trees, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The temperature dropped, and the surrounding darkness pressed in closer. The faint rustle of leaves came from the roadside, a sound too deliberate to be the wind. Both teens paused, their eyes scanning the shadows. From the blackness, a figure emerged, a tall, cloaked woman who seemed to float rather than walk. Her pale, otherworldly face gleamed faintly under the moonlight, and her outstretched arms beckoned with a haunting purpose. Frozen in place, one of them felt the chill of her presence before she enveloped him in an iron grip. The sensation was suffocating, as though the air itself had been stolen. His companion stood motionless, her heart pounding as she watched the figure lean closer to him. The silence was shattered with a piercing scream and a sound so unnatural and resonant that it reverberated through the trees and sent a shiver down the spines of both teens. In an instant, the figure released him and dissolved back into the darkness, leaving behind only the echo of her terrible cry. The two fled back towards town, their breaths ragged and minds reeling. The warmth of the familiar streets felt surreal after the icy, oppressive presence they had encountered. The legend of Huggin was no longer a distant story or a local myth. It was real, and the memory of that night would linger like a shadow in their lives, a chilling reminder of the unseen mysteries that sometimes walk among us. The frozen wind howled across the desolate shoreline, whipping up the snow and ice like restless spirits. Beneath the brittle crust of the Arctic waters, shadows stirred. The Qalupalik, a creature of ancient Inuit legend, waded beneath the ice, her green, translucent skin blending seamlessly with the frigid depths. Her long, webbed fingers traced lazy circles in the water, the eerie hum of her song vibrating through the frozen sea. It was a melody both alluring and foreboding, carrying the weight of countless tales whispered in the long Arctic nights. Above, a young boy wandered too close to the edge of the ice, his small boots crunching softly against the frosty ground. He was drawn in by the strange sound, though he couldn't understand why. The song wasn't loud, but it pulsed in his chest, pulling him towards the icy shore. The boy's family had often warned him about the Qalupalik, the child stealer who lurked beneath the ice. They say her voice could mesmerize, her touch as cold as death, but curiosity and youth had a stronger pull than fear that day. The ice beneath him groaned as he knelt to peer into the water. Deep below, the faint flicker of movement caught his eye. A face, pale and alien, surfaced for the briefest moment, a glimpse of sharp teeth and hollow, unblinking eyes. The boy stumbled back, breaking the spell as a long, clawed hand breached the surface, seeking purchase on the fragile ice. With a loud crack, the ice began to splinter. The boy scrambled backwards as the Qalupalik's hum grew louder, more insistent, her form rising ever closer to the surface. Just as she broke through, the boy's hand found a jagged rock. He hurled it instinctively at the creature, the sound of the impact echoing like a gunshot. The Qalupalik shrieked, a sound that pierced the icy air before vanishing beneath the waves, leaving the waters still once more. The boy fled, his heart pounding, the haunting melody still faintly echoing in his ears as he disappeared into the safety of his village. That night, as the elders recounted stories of the Qalupalik by the fire, the boy sat silently, clutching the rock that saved his life, vowing never to wander alone near that ice again. The air was heavy as dusk settled over the barren desert outside Kingman, Arizona. The last rays of sunlight painted the jagged cliffs of Slaughterhouse Canyon, in hues of deep crimson, as if the land itself bled from some ancient wound. A young hiker, Jake, ventured cautiously into the canyon, drawn in by haunting stories he had overheard in a roadside diner earlier that day. Locals called it La Llorona of the West, a place cursed by the ghost of a grieving mother who had lost her mind in the throes of starvation centuries ago. The trail narrowed as Jake moved deeper into the canyon. The walls loomed higher, their jagged edges casting long shadows that twisted like fingers reaching out to snare him. The only sounds were the crunch of gravel under his boots and the distant whispers of the wind. Yet, something else prickled at the edge of his senses, a faint, keening wail that seemed to rise and fall like a mournful lullaby. He paused, straining to hear. It was impossible to tell if the sound was real or the product of his own overactive imagination, fueled by the legend. They said a destitute family once lived here, the father gone too long on a failed hunt. In her despair, the mother had taken her children's lives, unable to watch them waste away. Her screams, they said, still echoed through the canyon. The wail grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the wind. Jake's pulse quickened as a chill crept up his spine, despite the desert heat. He glanced around, the walls now seeming to close in on him, the shadows deepening unnaturally. Something caught his eye, a faint movement near the edge of a rocky outcrop. It looked like a figure, draped in tattered white, swaying as if in mourning. Jake froze, heart pounding. The figure seemed to dissolve into the rock as quickly as it appeared, leaving nothing but an eerie cry that now surrounded him, louder and more anguished than before. Panic took hold. He turned and bolted back towards the entrance of the canyon, the sound chasing him like an unseen predator. When he finally emerged into the open desert, the crying ceased abruptly, as if the canyon itself had swallowed it whole. Gasping for breath, Jake glanced back, half expecting to see the figure again, but the canyon was silent, its blood-red walls now fading into the twilight. Jake didn't stop running until he reached his car. As he sped away, he realized the eerie wail wasn't just a legend. Something lingered in Slaughterhouse Canyon, something that refused to let go of its pain. The night was still, the air heavy with the damp chill of the Arkansas woods. James had heard the stories of the Gurdon light his entire life, but skepticism ran deep in his veins. He had always dismissed the tales as a mixture of folklore and overactive imaginations. Still, when his friends backed out of their late-night expedition to the old railroad tracks, he decided to go alone. He wanted to see for himself what all the fuss was about. He parked his truck at the edge of the woods and walked the narrow, overgrown trail that led to the tracks. His flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, illuminating rusted rails and tufts of grass growing between the ties. The cricket's chirping was the only sound he heard, but the deeper he ventured, the quieter the forest became, as if holding its breath. Reaching the section of tracks where the light was most often seen, James stopped and waited. The seconds stretched into minutes, and the oppressive silence began to gnaw at his nerves. He scanned the horizon, his flashlight flickering slightly. Then it appeared. At first, it was just a faint glow, hovering a few feet above the tracks. It wavered like a firefly, growing brighter and more distinct. The light seemed to pulse, shifting from white to an eerie green. James froze, his breath catching in his throat. The stories had always said the light was unexplainable, floating there without a source, detached from any natural explanation. As he watched, the light began to move, slowly at first, then faster, zigzagging along the rails. It danced erratically, as if it had a mind of its own. James felt his skin prickle, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. A chill seeped into his bones, and he suddenly felt the weight of the stories of the murdered railway worker whose spirit was said to haunt the stretch of track, searching for his lantern. The light darted closer, and James stumbled back, his flashlight slipping from his hand and plunging him into near-total darkness. He fumbled for it, but by the time he raised it again, the light was gone. The tracks lay empty, silent as the grave. Without waiting to see if it would return, James turned and sprinted back to his truck, the crunch of gravel underfoot chasing him like an echo. When he reached the safety of his vehicle, his chest heaving, he cast one last glance at the tree line. The light was gone. but he knew he would never dismiss the stories again. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the dense oaks and tangled underbrush of San Antonio Creek shrouded in shadow. Elise had always been drawn to the macabre, and the legend of Char Man, a ghostly figure said to haunt these woods, was too enticing to resist. Armed with only a flashlight and her phone to document the experience, she ventured out alone, waiting for the faint trail that hugged the edge of the creek. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and charred wood, an unsettling combination she chalked up to her overactive imagination. The stories always described Char Man as the tormented ghost of a man who perished in a fire, his burned and disfigured form forever wandering the area. Elise tried to brush off the unease prickling at her skin. Urban legends were just that, stories. The trail narrowed and the gurgling creek became a whisper in the distance. Her flashlight flickered, casting distorted shadows that danced among the trees. She stopped to adjust the batteries, her breath visible in the sudden chill. And that's when she smelled it, smoke. Acrid and sharp, it filled her nostrils, making her eyes water. She looked around, but saw no signs of a fire. Then, faintly, she heard the sound, a raspy wheeze like someone struggling for air, carried through the stillness. Her chest tightened as she scanned the woods, the beam of her flashlight trembling in her grip. The noise grew louder, accompanied by the crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. Elise's pulse quickened, her heart hammering against her ribs. She took a step back, her foot catching on an exposed root. She fell hard, the flashlight skittering out of reach. In the darkness, the wheezing sound closed in, now almost inhuman in its intensity. She scrambled for the flashlight, her fingers brushing against the cold, damp ground before gripping it. As she raised the beam, her breath caught. A figure stood just beyond the edge of the light, its outline warped and mishappened. The smell of smoke intensified, and the figure's skin seemed to glisten unnaturally, like a molten wax. It moved towards her, each step slow and deliberate, as if savoring her terror. Without thinking, Elise bolted, the flashlight bouncing wildly in her hand. She didn't look back, the sound of her own panicked breaths drowning out everything. The smell of the smoke clung to her as she reached the safety of her car and slammed the door shut. Driving away, she glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure pursuing her. But the road was empty, the woods eerily quiet. Still, the scent of smoke lingered in her nostrils, a reminder that some stories might not be so far from the truth.